The Grand Aurora Ball was a glittering spectacle. Under the light of cascading chandeliers, the city's elite toasted to wealth and ambition. Elizabeth Devereaux, CEO of the multi-billion-dollar tech company Innovex, radiated power and elegance in a custom scarlet gown. At 43, she had become synonymous with visionary leadership, steering her company to dominate the burgeoning AI market. This ball, hosted annually at her estate, wasn't merely a social affair, but a carefully curated networking arena. Elizabeth's eyes scanned the room as she sipped champagne, taking mental notes of who mingled with whom. Every handshake, every whisper mattered. Across the hall, her husband Daniel was the perfect host, chatting animatedly with a senator. Their marriage, celebrated in glossy magazines, symbolized a union of beauty and brains. He, the charming philanthropist; she, the ambitious innovator. It was during her exchange with an investor when Elizabeth noticed her younger brother Julian slip into the study at the edge of the ballroom. He rarely attended these gatherings, and his retreat caught her attention. Her brows furrowed briefly, but her face remained composed. "Excuse me for a moment," Elizabeth murmured, handing her flute to an assistant. As she approached the study, voices floated through the slightly ajar door. "This has to remain between us." Julian's tone was firm but tinged with nervousness. Another voice answered, too low to make out the words. Elizabeth froze, her analytical mind kicking into overdrive. Julian wasn't a conspirator by nature. He was a brilliant but straightforward software engineer. What could he be discovering that required secrecy during her party? And with whom? She inched closer and glimpsed a shadowy figure seated in the room. The voice became clearer. "I've handled my end. If the projections hold, Innovex's valuation will plummet before the quarter ends." Elizabeth's grip tightened on the doorframe. Projections? Valuation? It sounded like insider manipulation, a move that could devastate her company. Her heart raced, though her expression betrayed nothing. The figure leaned forward, their identity still obscured. "Ah, your sister has underestimated the old guard. Innovex grew too fast, stepped on too many toes. This will be a correction, nothing personal." Julian's voice dropped, almost pleading. "This isn't what we agreed. The door creaked under Elizabeth's weight. Julian and his mysterious companion froze, their faces jerking toward the sound. Elizabeth stepped in, her heels clicking ominously against the polished hardwood floor. His face paled and his mouth opened, but no words came out. The other man rose, his features emerging into the light. It was Charles Merrick, Innovex's former CFO, a man Elizabeth had forced out 2 years ago after uncovering financial discrepancies. "Well," Elizabeth said, her voice now cutting through the silence like a scalpel, "this is unexpected." Charles smirked, unfazed. "Elizabeth, always the one with perfect timing." Julian stood frozen, his hand trembling as he reached for a nearby folder. "Liz, it's not what you think." "Oh, I'm sure it isn't," she interrupted. Her gaze bore into her brother, then shifted to Charles. "And you? I thought I'd seen the last of you when you slithered off to your offshore holdings. How charming to see you again." Charles shrugged. "Business brings people together in strange ways." "Indeed it does," Elizabeth replied, her tone sharp. "Shall we discuss your business here, or would you prefer an audience with my lawyers?" Charles chuckled and started toward the door, but as he passed her, he leaned in. "Be careful, Elizabeth. Those closest to you often know where the cracks are." He left without waiting for a reply. Julian stood rooted, his face a mixture of guilt and fear. Elizabeth let the silence stretch, her fury simmering beneath a cold exterior. "Explain," she demanded finally, her voice a low command. "I'm—" Julian stammered. It's not what it seems. Charles approached me. He said it was about setting things right, that Innovex had become—" Her slap across the desk silenced him. "You think I don't know what Merrick is capable of? And you, my own brother, how much did he offer you to betray me?" Tears welled in Julian's eyes. "It's not about money, Liz, it's about survival. You've made enemies, and they're coming for you. He said he'd protect me if you helped to orchestrate my downfall." Elizabeth's voice rose, the hurt breaking through her composure. "You disgust me." Julian crumbled under her glare, his head sinking into his hands. For a moment, Elizabeth felt a pang of sorrow. She had trusted Julian implicitly. He was family. She clenched her fists. Trust had made her blind. Now she would weaponize that trust, turning it into the very thing that would destroy her enemies. "Go," she ordered. "Leave my house. Tomorrow you'll tell me everything, every detail about Merrick's scheme. And Julian?" He looked up, his tear-streaked face filled with despair. "If you ever cross me again, I won't just ruin you. I'll destroy everything you hold dear." Julian fled without a word. Elizabeth stood alone in the study, her mind racing with plans. The cracks were visible now. She would have to mend them, temporarily. And then she would strike. Elizabeth Devereux sat in her private suite, a sanctuary perched atop her sprawling estate. The midnight sky stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but her gaze was fixed on the folders strewn across her glass desk. Julian's words haunted her. "They're coming for you." The phrase gnawed at her, not for its melodrama, but because she knew it was true. Innovex's meteoric rise had disrupted industries, made enemies of entrenched powers, and rattled traditionalists. She had always believed her biggest threats were external, competitors, governments, or rogue hackers. Never her own flesh and blood. Her mind immediately went to Charles Merrick. It fit his playbook: small, incremental thefts that created cascading chaos when revealed. But if Merrick was involved, he wouldn't act alone. His arrogance always demanded accomplices to share the risk. She opened her secure messaging app and composed a message. To Alyssa Connors. Subject: urgent, internal forensics review. Details: full audit of all department heads and accounts. Focus on vendor relations. Deliver results directly to me. Discretion required. Alyssa, her head of cybersecurity, was one of the few people Elizabeth trusted without question. As the message sent, Elizabeth felt the familiar tension in her chest, the one that came when she could feel a storm brewing but couldn't yet see the clouds. Downstairs, the faint hum of the staff cleaning up the evening's lavish ball reminded her of the night's other revelation: Daniel. Her husband had been mingling a bit too comfortable with certain guests, particularly Catherine DuPont, the younger, striking COO of DuPont Ventures. Catherine was Daniel's charity partner, though Elizabeth doubted that charity work accounted for the extended glances and whispered exchanges. Elizabeth had chosen Daniel for his charm and public appeal, a calculated match to soften her reputation as a relentless business mogul. Their marriage had been practical, but she hadn't thought it would devolve into what she witnessed tonight. Her thoughts turned to Catherine. Could she be part of Merrick's plan? The timing of her increased presence in Daniel's life was suspicious. Elizabeth pulled up Catherine's public profile, then cross-referenced it with Innovex's corporate dealings. DuPont Ventures had recently backed out of a joint AI project, citing ethical concerns. A thin excuse at best. It aligned with Merrick's playbook: destabilize first, strike later. Elizabeth needed more information. The next morning, Elizabeth walked into Innovex's headquarters. The building was a marvel of modern engineering, sleek glass exteriors, sustainable infrastructure, and an interior that buzzed with innovation. Yet as she strode through the halls, she sensed a subtle unease. Employees glanced at her, their smiles too quick, their greetings overly formal. The office gossip mill was undoubtedly churning after Julian's late-night departure from the party. She entered the executive conference room for her scheduled meeting with the leadership team. As she settled into her chair, she took stock of the attendees. There was Marcus Cheng, head of operations, who avoided eye contact. Amelia Price, marketing chief, shuffled her notes nervously. Even Simon Drake, her loyal CFO, seemed tense. "Good morning, everyone," Elizabeth began, her voice as steady as ever. "Let's get started." The first half of the meeting progressed smoothly, with updates on product launches and market expansions. But when the agenda turned to financial reviews, Elizabeth noticed Simon's hesitation. "Simon," she said, leaning forward, "walk us through the vendor payments for the AI wing." Simon's face betrayed a flicker of discomfort before he launched into a carefully rehearsed explanation. The words were smooth, the data aligned perfectly, but Elizabeth felt the lie. As the meeting concluded, Elizabeth asked Simon to stay behind. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Simon," she said, closing the door behind the last departing executive, "but I need clarity on a few points." Simon stiffened. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Elizabeth leaned against the table, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "The discrepancies in vendor payments." "I know you're aware of them." Simon faltered for a moment, then quickly recovered. "It's minor, Elizabeth. Just timing issues with the invoicing process." "Timing issues." Her voice was calm but carried an edge. "That's not what the data shows, and I think you know that." Simon hesitated, his fingers twitching. Elizabeth took a step closer. "Who's pressuring you, Simon? Is it Merrick? Or someone else?" He looked away, his composure crumbling. "It's complicated." "It's simple," she corrected. "Either you tell me everything now, or I'll have Elisa and her team dismantle every financial record in this company. And when they find the truth, you'll be the first casualty." Simon sighed deeply, shoulders slumping in defeat. "It's not just Merrick. Daniel's involved." Elizabeth froze. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. "Daniel?" she repeated, disbelief sharpening her tone. "He's been funneling information to Merrick for months." "I don't know all the details, but it's about destabilizing Innovex, enough to force a buyout. Merrick has backers, powerful ones. They want you out, Elizabeth." Her mind reeled, but outwardly, she remained composed. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Simon hesitated. "Because I didn't think you'd believe me, and because I didn't want to lose everything." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "You've already lost my trust, Simon, but you can still save yourself. Send me everything you have, emails, transactions, anything. Do it discreetly." Simon nodded, looking like a man walking to the gallows. That evening, Elizabeth confronted Daniel at their estate. He was in his study, sipping scotch and scrolling through his tablet when she entered. "Busy night?" she asked, her voice deceptively casual. Daniel glanced up, surprised. "Elizabeth, didn't expect you home early." She crossed the room, stopping inches from him. "You've been busy too, haven't you? With Catherine? With Merrick?" Daniel's expression turned guarded. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Am I?" Elizabeth leaned closer, her voice a whisper now, cold and lethal. "You thought you could betray me and get away with it." Daniel smirked, though his confidence wavered. "You built a company that made enemies, Elizabeth. You've always thought you were untouchable." Her lips curled into a predator's smile. "I am untouchable, Daniel, and you're about to find out why." She turned and left, her mind already orchestrating her next move. Betrayal wasn't the end of her story, it was merely the beginning of her revenge. The days following her confrontation with Daniel passed in a flurry of covert activity. Elizabeth Devereux's once unshakable world was now a battlefield, and she was at its center, assembling her arsenal. The betrayal of her husband and brother was not merely personal. It was systemic, infecting every corner of her professional empire. The first step in reclaiming control was information. Elizabeth knew that data was power, and without it, she would be fighting blind. Alyssa Connors, her head of cybersecurity, delivered her findings at 2 a.m., the time when even the most ambitious enemies were likely to be asleep. "Here's what we found," Alyssa began, spreading a series of encrypted files across Elizabeth's sleek glass desk. "The discrepancies in vendor payments point to 3 shell companies. 2 are owned by Charles Merrick. The third is under your husband's name. Funneled offshore," Alyssa continued. "Some of it has been reinvested into Innovex's competitors. They're using your own money to sabotage your company." Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing. The moves were bold, almost reckless, something Merrick would never attempt unless he felt invincible. The involvement of Daniel and Julian had emboldened him. "And Daniel's communications?" Elizabeth asked. Alyssa hesitated. "We intercepted encrypted messages between him and Catherine DuPont. She's coordinating with Merrick. The 2 of them have been leaking internal Innovex documents to undercut your market share." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. Catherine was more than a dalliance for Daniel. She was a co-conspirator. "Do we have evidence tying them to Merrick?" Alyssa handed over a USB drive, phone logs, meeting schedules, and flight records. "It's all there." Elizabeth took the drive, her steel composure unyielding. "Good work, Alyssa. Prepare a second-level sweep. I want everything Merrick, Daniel, and Catherine have touched in the last year, no stone unturned." Eliza nodded and left. Elizabeth remained at her desk, staring at the files. The evidence felt like shards of glass, cutting, painful, but necessary to rebuild her defenses. The next day, Elizabeth returned to Innovex. Her office, perched on the top floor of the gleaming headquarters, was her fortress. Today, however, she felt its walls were closing in. Simon Drake, her CFO, had sent over his cache of emails and financial documents, as promised. Reviewing them, Elizabeth saw the scale of Merrick's ambitions. He wasn't just trying to destabilize Innovex, he wanted to dismantle it completely. His backers included a consortium of old-guard tech tycoons, all threatened by Innovex's innovations in artificial intelligence and automation. But Elizabeth's scrutiny uncovered something even more sinister. In one of the emails, Catherine DuPont referenced a private deal between Merrick and Julian. It wasn't just about corporate sabotage, it was a hostile takeover. Elizabeth summoned Julian to her estate that evening. He arrived hesitantly, his usual confidence eroded by guilt. "I don't have time for pleasantries," Elizabeth began as soon as he entered her study. She placed the email in front of him. "Explain this." Julian's eyes widened as he read the damning words. "I didn't. Liz, this isn't what it looks like." "Don't insult me, Julian," she snapped. "You gave Merrick access to proprietary Innovex technology. This wasn't just betrayal, it was corporate espionage." Julian crumbled, sinking into a chair. "He said it was just a safety net. He said he could protect us, me, from the fallout if Innovex collapsed." Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice icy. "Protect you? From me? Do you know how absurd that sounds?" "I was scared." Julian admitted, his voice breaking. "You've made so many enemies, Liz. I thought—" "You thought wrong," she cut him off. "You thought you could trust Merrick, a man I fired for corruption, over your own sister." Julian's silence spoke volumes. Elizabeth sat back, forcing herself to remain calm. She needed Julian not as an ally, but as a pawn. "You're going to help me dismantle his operation," she said. "If you don't, I'll bury you alongside him." Julian nodded weakly. That night, Elizabeth made another call to Thomas Brand, her lawyer and longtime confidant. "I need a corporate restructuring plan," she told him. "I'm creating new holding companies for Innovex's intellectual property, and I want every patent, every prototype, protected under separate entities." Thomas, ever the pragmatist, responded swiftly. "This will cause a stir with the board, Elizabeth." "Let them stir," she replied. "I'm not asking for their permission." The restructuring would shield Innovex's assets from the chaos Merrick was orchestrating. Even if the company itself was attacked, its core innovations would remain untouchable. Meanwhile, Elizabeth began working on Daniel. She was methodical, planting seeds of doubt through carefully orchestrated encounters. The first was at a gala for the city's most influential philanthropists. Elizabeth arrived late, catching Daniel and Catherine in a secluded conversation. She approached with an air of indifference, but her presence was calculated to unsettle. "Darling," she said, her voice smooth, "you should have told me Catherine would be here. I would have brought her those AI project summaries she's been so curious about." Daniel stiffened, and Catherine's smile faltered. The tension was palpable. Elizabeth stayed just long enough to plant suspicion in Catherine's mind about Daniel's loyalty. The second encounter was even subtler. Elizabeth had Elisa send a leaked document to Daniel's private email, a fabricated report suggesting Merrick was planning to cut Daniel out of the final deal. Within hours, Daniel's demeanor shifted. He became more withdrawn, his confidence shaken. Elizabeth observed him from a distance, watching as her trap closed in. The final blow came during a surprise board meeting Elizabeth called at Innovex. "This meeting is to discuss Innovex's future," she began, her voice commanding the room. "Recent events have made it clear that our company's stability is under threat. I've initiated a restructuring plan to ensure our survival." As she spoke, she unveiled the evidence against Merrick, his shell companies, the siphoned funds, and the conspiracy to destroy Innovex. The board members were stunned into silence. "But Merrick didn't act alone," Elizabeth continued. Her eyes swept the room before landing on Daniel. "He had help! Inside Innovex and inside my own home." The silence was deafening as Elizabeth laid out Daniel's betrayal. The evidence was irrefutable, from bank statements to intercepted emails. Daniel rose, his face pale. "Elizabeth, this isn't—" "Sit down," she ordered, her tone brooking no argument. "You've already said enough." The board, swayed by the overwhelming evidence, voted unanimously to remove Daniel from any involvement with Innovex. That evening, Elizabeth returned home to an empty house. Daniel had packed and left, his arrogance replaced with defeat. Julian, too, had disappeared, his shame too great to face her. Elizabeth stood in her private suite, looking out at the city skyline. The storm wasn't over, but the tide had turned. She had dismantled the web of betrayal one thread at a time, but she knew it wasn't the end. Merrick and Catherine still lingered, and Elizabeth had no intention of letting them walk away unscathed. This was her company, her life, and her legacy, and Elizabeth Devereaux never lost. Elizabeth Devereaux sat at the head of the Innovex war room, the only light coming from a wall of monitors that flickered with endless streams of data. Her trusted circle surrounded her: Alyssa Connors, her cybersecurity chief, Thomas Brand, her unflinching attorney, and Simon Drake, who, despite his earlier betrayal, had proven useful in navigating the treacherous warfare of corporate warfare. She had torn apart Merrick's scheme, dismantled Daniel's influence, and stripped Julian of his leverage. But the battle was far from over. Elizabeth had learned one thing through years of dominating the tech industry: a wounded enemy was often the most dangerous. "We need to bait Merrick into making his next move," Elizabeth said, her tone sharp and decisive. "If we remain reactive, he'll dictate the terms. It's time to flip the narrative." Simon cleared his throat. "What do you propose?" Elizabeth glanced at Elisa, who nodded and activated a presentation on the monitors. "We fabricate a vulnerability," Elisa explained. "We create the illusion that Innovex's AI division is teetering on collapse, a flaw in the code, a critical delay in product launch. Merrick won't be able to resist exploiting it. And when he does," Elizabeth added, her voice steely, "we'll follow the breadcrumbs to uncover his backers and dismantle his operation." Thomas leaned forward, intrigued. "What's the risk? If Merrick suspects it's a trap—" Elizabeth cut him off. "He won't. He's emboldened by his recent successes. Daniel and Catherine made him believe I'm distracted, vulnerable. He'll take the bait." The team set the plan in motion the next day. Carefully planted leaks hinted at trouble in Innovex's AI division. Whispers of budget overruns, rumors of faulty algorithms, and speculation about a key client withdrawing. The leaks were orchestrated to look organic, spreading through niche tech forums and low-level industry insiders, before escalating to mainstream business blogs. Elizabeth watched the chatter grow, noting with satisfaction how Merrick's fingerprints appeared almost immediately. He leaked insider information through his usual channels, confirming the fabricated flaws and projecting Innovex's stock to plummet. The trap was set. As Merrick moved to capitalize on Innovex's perceived weakness, Elisa was ready. Using a sophisticated tracking algorithm embedded in the leaked documents, she traced Merrick's digital communications. The results revealed more than Elizabeth had hoped for. Merrick's network was vast, involving not only Catherine, but also several other executives in competing firms and government regulators. "It's a hydra," Elisa said grimly, zooming in on the web of connections. "Even if we take down Merrick, the rest of the network will regroup." Elizabeth studied the diagram, her mind working faster than ever. "Then we strike at the head and the heart simultaneously." She tasked Elisa with infiltrating the network further, planting false information to sow distrust among Merrick's allies. Meanwhile, Thomas began drafting the legal groundwork to target Innovex's competitors with lawsuits for intellectual property theft, breach of contract, and industrial espionage. "Hit them hard and fast," Elizabeth instructed. "They'll be too busy defending themselves to retaliate." Amidst the chaos, Elizabeth received a surprising call from Senator Michael Wren. The senator, a longtime advocate for innovation in AI, had once been a staunch supporter of Innovex. His tone, however, was cautious as he greeted her. "Elizabeth," he began, "I've heard rumblings about Innovex's recent troubles. I wanted to check in." Elizabeth recognized the subtext immediately. Wren wasn't calling out of concern, he was fishing for information. "We're managing the challenges," she replied smoothly. "What have you heard?" Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. Merrick's endgame wasn't just a corporate takeover, it was an industry-wide power grab. "And where do you stand on this, Senator?" Wren chuckled. "You know me, I stand where the facts do." Elizabeth leaned back, an idea forming. "Then let me give you the facts. My team has uncovered a coordinated effort to destabilize not just Innovex, but the entire AI market. If you're willing to help me expose it, I can ensure you're seen as the champion of fair innovation." Wren's interest was piqued. "Send me the details and we'll talk." While Alyssa and Thomas worked to weaken Merrick's network, Elizabeth turned her focus to Catherine DuPont. She knew Catherine would prove a vital link to Merrick's undoing. Using the data Alyssa had uncovered, Elizabeth identified a critical vulnerability. DuPont Ventures was deeply leveraged in a series of risky acquisitions, many of which were dependent on Innovex's supposed collapse. Elizabeth orchestrated a meeting with Catherine under the guise of negotiation. They met in a sleek downtown office, Catherine arriving with her usual confidence, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. "Elizabeth!" Catherine greeted her, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't expect you to request a meeting." Elizabeth matched her cool demeanor. "I wanted to address the rumors directly. I'm sure you've heard about Innovex's troubles." Catherine's smile widened slightly. "It's unfortunate, but these things happen in business." Elizabeth leaned forward. "Indeed, they do. And sometimes those responsible for orchestrating them get caught." Catherine's expression faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "I'm not sure I follow." "Oh, I think you do," Elizabeth replied, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were detailed records of Catherine's communications with Merrick, along with evidence tying DuPont Ventures to the shell companies funneling stolen funds. "This is enough to bury you, Catherine, but I'm offering you a way out." Catherine's confidence cracked. "What do you want?" "Simple," Elizabeth said. "I want you to turn on Merrick, feed him false information, cut ties with his backers, and ensure DuPont Ventures withdraws from its acquisitions. In return, I won't take this to the authorities, or you're bored." Catherine hesitated, then nodded. "Deal." As Catherine sabotaged Merrick from within, Elisa's infiltration revealed the final pieces of his plan. He had leveraged his network to force a hostile bid for Innovex's assets, planning to buy them for pennies on the dollar after spreading rumors of bankruptcy. Elizabeth acted swiftly. Using Thomas's legal expertise, she filed a federal lawsuit against Merrick and his backers citing conspiracy and fraud. She also released a public statement exposing the network's actions and framing Innovex as a victim of malicious corporate sabotage. The media frenzy that followed was a masterstroke. Merrick's reputation was shattered, his allies distanced themselves, and his backers scrambled to contain the fallout. On a crisp Friday morning, Elizabeth stood in Innovex's main conference room, flanked by her trusted team. The board, now fully aligned with her vision, had unanimously voted to implement her restructuring plan. Innovex emerged stronger than ever, its assets untouchable and its enemies in disarray. As Elizabeth gazed out the window at the bustling city below, she allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. She had not just survived the betrayal, she had transformed it into an opportunity to solidify her legacy. But Elizabeth knew better than to rest. The world of power and ambition was a relentless game, and she had no intention of ever letting her guard down again. Elizabeth Devereux stood on the rooftop terrace of Innovex's headquarters, the city sprawling beneath her. The early morning light painted the skyline in shades of gold and crimson, as if celebrating her victory. But Elizabeth knew better than to see triumph as an endpoint. In her world, victories were fleeting, and the true test lay in what followed. Her empire was intact, stronger even, but the scars of betrayal lingered. She sipped her coffee, allowing herself a rare moment of introspection. The weeks of counterattacks, legal maneuvering, and calculated strategy had cemented her position at the top. But at what cost? The downfall of Merrick and his network had been absolute. Federal investigations were underway, with Charles Merrick and Catherine DuPont under intense scrutiny. Catherine, eager to save herself, had turned state's witness, providing damning evidence against Merrick and several corporate executives. The media had painted Elizabeth as a resilient hero, a symbol of integrity in a cutthroat industry. But behind the glowing headlines, she knew the truth. Her husband, her brother, and even her company's leadership had betrayed her. Her marriage to Daniel was over, finalized in a cold, efficient proceeding that left him with little beyond his pride. The courts had sided with Elizabeth in every aspect, thanks to the mountain of evidence she had collected. Julian had gone dark, retreating to Europe under the pretense of finding himself. Elizabeth let him go, knowing his absence was as much a punishment as any direct action she could take. But the hardest loss was her faith in others. Once she had believed that loyalty could be cultivated, that trust could form the bedrock of relationships. Now she saw those notions as luxuries she could no longer afford. Elizabeth's first act after the dust settled was to overhaul Innovex's internal culture. She implemented a rigorous transparency initiative, ensuring no single individual could wield unchecked power. Her leadership team was reshaped, with Alyssa Connors promoted to COO, a decision that raised eyebrows but silenced dissent when Alyssa proved herself indispensable. To safeguard the company's future, Elizabeth established an independent ethics board. She knew this move would be seen as performative by some, but she was determined to build an organization that could withstand even the most insidious attacks. If trust was a liability, systems of accountability would take its place. She also initiated partnerships with startups and academic institutions, shifting Innovex's image from an insular tech giant to an inclusive innovator. It wasn't just about optics. It was about ensuring that Innovex remained adaptable and forward-thinking. Weeks later, Elizabeth was invited to deliver the keynote at the World AI Summit, a prestigious gathering of industry leaders, policymakers, and innovators. Her speech was an opportunity to assert not just Innovex's dominance, but her own indomitable spirit. Standing under the bright stage lights, Elizabeth's presence was magnetic. Dressed in a sleek black suit that radiated authority, she began, "Innovation thrives where trust is forged." But trust, as we have seen, can be weaponized, exploited, and shattered. The events of the past months have tested me, my company, and this industry, and yet, here we stand. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. Betrayal is not the end. It is a challenge, a call to adapt, to rise stronger. Innovex has risen, not just because of its technology, but because of the principles that guide us: resilience, accountability, and the relentless pursuit of progress. Her speech was met with thunderous applause, but Elizabeth barely registered it. This wasn't about applause or recognition. It was about cementing her authority in a world that had sought to undermine her. Despite her success, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered in the shadows. Merrick's backers had scattered, but she doubted they had vanished entirely. Power was rarely surrendered willingly. She had disrupted their plans, but they would regroup. One evening, as she reviewed Innovex's new security protocols, a message arrived on her private phone. It was from an unknown number, the text brief and cryptic. "Every empire has its cracks. Stay vigilant." Elizabeth stared at the message, her heart steady but her mind racing. She forwarded it to Alyssa, instructing her to trace its origin. But deep down, she already knew it was a reminder, a signal that the battles she had fought were only the beginning. The months turned into years, and Innovex continued to thrive. Elizabeth became a fixture in the global tech community, her story a case study in resilience and strategic brilliance. Yet, the scars of betrayal remained etched in her psyche, shaping how she led, how she trusted, and how she lived. Her relationships became carefully curated, her inner circle limited to those who had proven their loyalty in the crucible of crisis. Even Alyssa, her most trusted ally, was never granted full access to the depths of Elizabeth's plans. One day, as she stood in her estate's garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had sacrificed much to protect her empire: love, trust, and perhaps even parts of herself. But she had emerged unbroken, her vision sharper than ever. Because in the end, Elizabeth Devereux understood what others did not. In a world of betrayal and ambition, survival wasn't enough. You had to win.